Okay, so back in Jersey, 29 Sunset Drive, in the room where I said it all got started, insofar as this is where I dwelled as a high school student when I started reading philosophy. As well, in this room, I played a lot of music. This is where I had my percussion set up, my drums set up, and a lot of things happened. So back here, this is where I started in February of this year, 2014, when I got this project underway. This is where the first meditations were recorded, and I'm back here because of my own sort of peripatetic sojourn wandering. No surprise, right? Philosophy, art, everything comes out of our experience, really, in the end. And so, here I am. And the routine that I have is that, at least during the semester, I come to this space and I'm here for the middle of the week when I'm teaching at Hofstra. I come from Long Island to New Jersey, and I work from this particular space on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then I leave back to the Hofstra campus on Long Island on Thursday morning, and then ultimately back to my home in Maine on Thursday evening. And I'll do that until for another month, a little more than a month, about 6 more weeks, and then be in Maine from May through August. So here I am back and picking it up. Yesterday there was this important and interesting transition that happened from chapter 3 to chapter 4 in Being and Learning. Now, for those of you just jumping on, what I've been doing is, originally I wrote every day a phenomenological meditation every day in the spirit of the sort of Arendtian Heideggerian thinking, sort of taking up that positionality that they themselves identified as being initiated by the earliest ancient Greeks, even before Socrates. That's important for Heidegger, but then Socrates becomes really the exemplar, I think, for Arendt, although not exclusively, of course. And so placing oneself in that modality of thinking, which I think Arendt did best with her metaphor of drawing on Penelope and the weaving and unweaving of the tapestry that Penelope was engaged in. Every day, weaving and unweaving, that the phenomenological meditations was a phenomenology of thinking, pursuing the question of thinking as learning. So the relationship between being and learning is emerging and being accounted for in a phenomenology of thinking. And yesterday, as I was reading the meditation that I originally wrote on the 25th of March, 2004, so every day I wrote a meditation, and ultimately it became this book, Being and Learning. 10 years later, I'm going back and rereading the original meditations. Yesterday, when I was going to read it, I realized that the copies that I had, a page fell out, and I went back and had to go to the original printout that's in a binder in my office. It's in 2 binders in my office in Hagedorn Hall, Hofstra. And it turns out that meditation is actually a break. And it's a break from chapter 3, which is called The Way of Lao Tzu, to chapter 4, which is on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And it's a fascinating break, and I talked about it yesterday, and I'll just talk a little bit about it, because it happened on the very paragraph that was passage, right? Passage denotes, the transition occurs with this sentence. Passage denotes a portion or section of a written work. So the passage in the middle of this meditation from the 25th of March is this passage right here, which you can't see because it sort of bleaches out. And it's a passage on passage. Passage also means the act or instance of passing from one place to another. So we're moving from the place of Lao Tzu to the place of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, the way of the sage to the Allegory of the Cave. And that's where we are right now. So it was interesting, and I talked about it. It's fascinating for a lot of reasons. I don't recall that I made this move when I made it with the intention of that sort of interesting, but now I would 100% declare that that's significant, that chapter 3 and 4 is broken with this particular paragraph. It works perfectly. It's the threshold, If I was so clever to have designed it in this way, but it's not, as I 2 days ago quoted from Lao Tzu, the way of the sage is one of spontaneity, not scheming. So Spontaneity is the hallmark of the sage, is what he said. I'm not claiming to be a sage. I am claiming, though, to follow the way of the sage and also the way of saying, sage. So anyway, on to number, I think 41 we're up to, 42. It's the meditation originally written on the 27th of March. So now we're into chapter 4. This is pages 69 and 70 from Being and Learning. With his reading, let me back up. Sorry. In the opening section of this work, much was made of education as a process of learning that is initiated by the turning around of the apprentice. We've gone on to explore this turning around and the further moment of attunement, which signifies learning as a purposeful wandering together, as brought about by the reception of the evocative speech initially offered by the sage. With Plato's Allegory of the Cave, we return to examine again this turning around as the important takeoff point for learning. Our concern here is to reread the allegory in order to further understand why learning is the essence of the relationship between being and beings, and specifically how this relationship unfolds for the human being when they are attuned to the horizon of being and enjoined to one another. Thus we will explore the allegory as a tale of overcoming ignorance, or the releasement from the domesticity of common sense, but emphasize why this transcendence is a returning of community, a recollection of being together, a cultivation of relatedness or enjoyment. This enjoyment and attunement is initiated by an original turning that we have called novel, spontaneous, or the modality of natality. We may now see why this turning is the essence of learning, because attunement and turning is located within the twofold play, which shows that the relationship upon which learning is grounded and moves is always already not yet fulfilled or consummated. If learning is the purposeful wandering together that unfolds through the sharing of stories, pilgrim's tales, the giving and receiving of teachability is the passing of the cup, then this cup is always already not yet full, always empty and filled. More atmosphere. I have to break. I don't know if this is coming up on the audio, but this is like when I was in New Mexico, atmospheric sound. So anyway, that's the garage door going up underneath me. The original turning, then, is a moment within the twofold play. It is the tuning, the adjustment, that is always part of the process of learning. In order to make music, an instrument must constantly be kept in tune, and thus constantly tuned or modally adjusted. The originary turning is akin to this perpetual tuning. This turning is part of the leap into the way of learning. Borrowing from Heidegger, we might call this originary turning, quote, grounding attunement, or that which, quote, attunes Dasein, and thus attunes thinking, as projecting open the truth of being in a word and concept, unquote. The turning brought about by the evocative saying of the ultimate first questions is the grounding attunement that signifies an original and perpetual event. Insofar as we are learning, this wandering is always and constantly moved by the reception of evocative saying that reposes the apprentices. Learning is thus an ongoing event that is continuously initiated. To describe it as continuously initiated is also to identify spontaneity, improvisation, and natality at the root of learning. These roots, which represent the destiny of our being, are rediscovered when the apprentice wanders out upon the unstable field and breaks the ground. This destiny is offered as a message, a tidings that turns the apprentices around. This message, passed along through evocative speech, is, quote, the grounding attunement that calls to us, startled, dismayed, provoked irritation, reservedness, deep awe, intimating deep foreboding, unquote. The allegory is thus the story of learning's destiny as the ongoing returning of beings to the horizon as an open field of relatedness, initiated perpetually by the grounding attunement that draws beings into their proper relation with being. Learning is the ongoing cultivation of community moved on by the originary grounding attunement. We got underway by recalling that in the sixth book of the Republic, Plato describes the philosopher as the real lover of learning. That's from the Republic 485. We further recall that in Book 7 he argues that every human soul is capable of learning how to contemplate being. Thus the real lover of learning is the learner who desires to behold being. In the seventh book he says, just as one might have to turn the whole body around in order that the eye should see light instead of darkness, so the entire soul must be turned away from the world of becoming until it is able to endure the sight of being and the most brilliant light of being, the supreme splendor that which we have called the good. That's from the Republic 518 to 519. Further along in Book 7 he identifies authentic education as the art of circumturning or conversion, an art that turns us towards the good. Education is not the art of putting sight into the eye that can already see, but one of turning the eye towards the proper gaze of being. That's what must be managed, Plato insists. The context of Plato's claims about authentic education is the Allegory of the Cave. That's where it ends. So, really important return. So if part of the theme of this particular meditation is this returning, and it's churning around, right? So what the claim is here is that what we can call the fundamental reduction, or the first reduction, back to the roots. So using phenomenological language, phenomenology, or at least the way that I understand it, talks of a reduction, right? So it's where it all begins, or the root of it, the root of the matter. So what is the sort of root or the ground of the work, of the project? Well, the ground or the root of the project that I'm calling attention to is what I'm calling being's presencing, right? So the turning that happens is a returning to that ground. And what is disclosed, as I've said over and over again, is human freedom, right? So it's this effacement, unmediated effacement with human freedom, right? And it's learning, the first moment of it, capital L learning, is that effacement. It's always already there. Human freedom is always already there. It's the fundamental a priori of the human condition. It's what you could say defines human. What defines human is freedom. And so that's what the whole project is reduced to. That's what the experiment is, sort of. It's an experiment in human freedom, if you will, right? So all art and philosophy, generally speaking, arises from that, but not just that, right? It's why when we create constitutional democratic political spaces, what we're doing is we're trying to protect freedom, right? We're creating the space for the possibility of that. Now, I'm not going to get into a digression on that, but I just want to so that's the first reduction. So the returning is a churning around to that. So now here what I'm doing with the writing is returning back to the first most essential reduction. So there's two reductions. One, the ontological reduction to the fundamental, right, to being's presencing. And that is a disclosure of human freedom. But there's the other sort of secondary reduction, which is the returning or reduction to the takeoff point, the prompt. So the prompt for the whole work, for being and learning, for the writing, what got me underway, is this Plato, the Republic, book 6 and 7. So book 4 then, or chapter 4 in the book, is a big return back to, okay, let's go back to the beginning again. And I've talked about this. I've talked about this in the last couple of commentaries, where that's part of the process, right? Is this process, again, Penelope unweaving the tapestry every day. What I talk about it as in two ways. One, as the dropping of a stone. So the stones represent fragments, concepts, words that I go back to, and this is the first one that got dropped. these sentences from Plato's Republic, and then follow those out, the rings that are created by that stone, and then once the water stills, come back and drop them again. That's the one way I've been talking about. The other way I've been talking about is compression. So both sort of earthly metaphors. So on the one hand, you have the dropping of the stone, and on the other hand, you have this compression that produces minerals, produces gems, right? So the idea that you keep repeating in the writing sentences and concepts and words, and you keep going over and over. So it's a compression that then in the end will produce what one hopes are gems. So this is mixing of metaphors, all very stony, right? Anyway, so going back to the beginning, right? Is this dropping again of the stone from Plato's Republic? And what's important here, though, at this point, and I just want to call attention to this, is that something here that people that read the book or that are listening, if anyone's, but it's interesting to point out for me, is that, of course, Plato says, in the Republic, 6th book, that the philosopher is the real lover of learning. So that, I say, 100%, that's a stone, I drop it. It's a key stone. It's a key starting point for me. That may be actually the starting point. So on the one hand, the reduction to being, and being disclosing our freedom, and then this, that the philosopher is the real lover of learning. That would be the sort of reduction to the beginning of the project. Now, but of course, what is that? So that's an evocative saying to me. So that arrives to me as a prompt. Okay, what does it mean to be the real lover of learning? What is this? What's involved in that? And that's what the writing is about. So that I embrace. The real lover of learning is the one who desires to behold being. Well, beholding being is the effacement, right? The showing or the disclosedness of freedom. The real lover of learning is the one who wants and desires that relationship, that wants that disclosure, right? So we desire freedom. We desire to have our freedom disclosed to us, right? That's the real lover of learning. That's the philosopher. And then, that positions them as the learner, and then the learner, does something with that, with the gift that is offered from being, as I've talked about. Right? You do something with your freedom. That's what defines the learner, the one who does something with their freedom, if you will. So, but here is where I definitely am pushing back against Plato, and here's how. Because it becomes complicated. He says, just as one might have to turn the whole body around in order that the eye see light instead of darkness, so the entire soul must be turned away from the world of becoming until it is able to endure the sight of being and the most brilliant light of being, the supreme splendor which we have called the good. That's Republic of Plato. Now, of course, this is Plato, one could say, taking on Parmenides' project of these two worlds of being and becoming. Right? And on the one hand, I'm saying, yeah, I agree with that. I'm embracing this notion that beings, there's something stable about freedom, that it's a non-negotiable, right? That's the reduction to this fundamental starting point, which is always already there. That's why I always use this phrase, always already there, with the backslash not yet, because the always already there of freedom is not yet manifested. Right? That's the not yet part of it. It's not yet brought into being. Into our world. We have to bring it into being. So it's the one half of it being offered, the other half of it being taken up. Okay. So I'm with Plato on this notion, this claim, this assertion that it's always already present. So there's a certain stability to it. We can go back to it. It's the well, right? It's that we can draw from. The well is there. From our perspective, it doesn't dry out. However, I depart from him in a really radical way and sort of go towards, I suppose, a more Heraclitean, perspective. And this is why I draw on Lao Tzu, because the curious thing about being is that being... Hello! Okay, good luck. That's now the fourth cameo appearance. That's my mother, my dear mother. She's going to the doctor. Okay. Opening the door. So this stability or this constant presence of presencing. So I'm not making this distinction between what sounds like a static being, but Plato's so interesting because he uses in the Allegory of the Cave, and this is where I'm going, the image of the sun. The sun is stable from our perspective. The sun rises and sets, and when we're grateful when it's not, the clouds aren't covering. Most of the time we're grateful when the clouds aren't covering the sun, so the sun's shining can appear to us. But the sun's constants is a constant dynamic, right? I mean, I don't need to rehearse this. Anyone who's watching this understands what I'm saying. It's a dynamic. It even appears to us in a dynamic as something that's, shining, and it's not a stable thing. It's not a stable phenomena. It's a dynamic phenomena. Even though there's this relationship with something that's predictable, more or less, and stable. Although, as we know, our experience with it is that some days are longer and some days are shorter. We just passed through the spring equinox, and I didn't even make a mention of that on the 20th, right? So that was the equal hours of daylight, sun, and moon, I suppose, or darkness. It's measured by the sun, though, right? Discovered by a Greek, ancient Greek. The point being that the sun, even though it's stable, is disclosing itself in a dynamic way. It enters into our world, and we relate to it dynamically. It's a dynamic phenomena. It's not static. So this tension between something that is stable and always sort of reliable, something that we can, count on, yet it's emerging into our world is very dynamic. It creates dynamism. We are related dynamically to it, and it shows us dynamism. And I think that Plato actually is suggesting this. I think that, by using, the sun as something that is, in the Allegory of the Cave, as we'll talk about, the source of all things, the good, but yet, surely he recognized that the sun is something that's dynamic and isn't static. So this is, my point here is that going back to Plato is interesting and important for me, because I think he enables me to work both sides of this notion of being as both always there, revealing and disclosing for humans freedom, but insofar as it's disclosing that, it's doing it in a dynamic way. It's showing dynamism as the way of freedom. Right, and I mean the implications of this for politics and for ethics and law, I think, are very important, because it's at the heart of this notion of, the law, and that's why it's interesting that at the end, Plato, which I'm not going to go into a whole dissertation on Plato right now, his final work is the law, on the laws, and it's a different kind of Plato that we rarely talk about, which is interesting. But anyway, the focus of this chapter and the ongoing meditations is the Allegory of the Cave. Important piece, and that's where I'm going to leave it on this 26th day of March 2014, having read pages 69 to 70 and being at learning, which is originally written March 26th, 2004.